I wasn't searching for victories. I was searching for proof of fear. The kind of fear that changes doctrine, rewrites training manuals, and makes experienced combat pilots pull an ejection handle while their aircraft is still flying perfectly straight. The footage I expected to find showed missiles striking targets. What I found instead were men abandoning machines that were not yet dying. The pattern first appears not over the Taiwan Strait, but over the Middle East in 1967, during the opening days of the Six-Day War, when Israeli Mirage 3s armed with AIM-9 Sidewinders began encountering Egyptian and Syrian MiG-21s. Gun camera reels show something unsettling. A MiG banking hard, a Sidewinder leaving the rail, its thin white smoke cutting across the desert sky, and then, 3 seconds before impact, the canopy separates. The pilot ejects. The missile destroys an empty aircraft. At first glance, it looks like panic. It wasn't. It was recognition. That distinction matters, and it becomes the thread that ties this entire story together. Intelligence summaries from the period tried to rationalize the behavior. Some analysts suggested the pilots mistook the missile's smoke trail for engine fire. Others argued faulty ejection seats or oversensitive safety mechanisms. But MiG-21 pilots were not novices. They trained extensively for compressor stalls, flameouts, and battle damage. They knew the difference between internal failure and external threat. The recurring detail in after-action reports is chilling in its simplicity. Pilots ejected upon visually confirming the missile's maneuvering capability. Not when it hit. Not when it detonated nearby. When it turned. The moment a pilot saw a missile correct its path in mid-air, saw it track with intent rather than fly ballistic, he understood something fundamental had changed. Soviet doctrine had long emphasized speed, climb rate, and high-G maneuvering as survival tools. Outrun the threat. Outturn the threat. But a heat-seeking missile that could follow engine exhaust through a brake turn erased that logic in seconds. The decision cycle was brutally short. Identify launch, observe tracking, calculate survival probability. Conclude 0. Pull the handle. From canopy separation to parachute deployment takes only moments, but in those moments a pilot watches his aircraft, his shield, his weapon, his status, become debris. Between 1967 and 1970, multiple documented cases show Arab pilots ejecting before Sidewinder impact. Some returned to flight status quickly. Some never flew combat again. A few disappear from accessible records, reassigned, quietly sidelined, or politically buried. The emotional cost is harder to trace than the hardware loss. To abandon a functional aircraft is to admit that technology has outpaced courage. And that is where this story truly begins, because the Sidewinder was never supposed to be decisive. It began in the early 1950s at China Lake as a modest Navy project, overshadowed by the radar-guided Sparrow program that promised long-range, high-tech dominance. The Sparrow was elegant, complex, and doctrinally fashionable. The Sidewinder was simple, almost crude by comparison, a heat seeker that followed infrared radiation from engine exhaust. No continuous radar lock, no guidance updates, fire and forget. The Navy appreciated that simplicity. Carrier pilots needed to maneuver immediately after launch, not fly straight and exposed while shepherding a missile to target. The Air Force was skeptical. Too short-ranged, too unsophisticated, too naval. But combat has a way of humiliating theoretical objections. When the Sidewinder proved in real engagements that it could track, turn, and kill with alarming reliability, skepticism evaporated. What mattered was not range on paper but reaction time in the cockpit. And in that cockpit, when a pilot saw a missile pivot in pursuit, doctrine collapsed into instinct. The revolution was not just mechanical. It was psychological. But the other 3 aircraft were lost without the clean, cinematic symmetry of that first encounter. The early 4-for-4 success had been a flash of lightning, not a permanent climate shift. Once larger numbers were studied, the AIM-9B's real combat effectiveness settled closer to 15%. In statistical terms, The miracle dissolved. In psychological terms, the damage was already done. 4 perfect kills had traveled faster than any after-action correction ever could. Within months, the U.S. Air Force, which had once dismissed the Sidewinder as a short-range Navy compromise, reversed course. By 1959, Air Force squadrons were wiring their fighters to carry the same simple missile they had considered doctrinally inferior. That institutional pivot is the hinge of this story, because it shows how quickly skepticism collapses when confronted with combat evidence. The missile itself remained crude by later standards. The AIM-9B could only lock onto a target's exhaust from the rear quarter. Its seeker head saw the world through a narrow cone. It lacked the muscular agility of later variants. It could not snap across high off-bore sight angles or sustain extreme G-loads. Its effective range rarely exceeded 2 miles in ideal conditions. Yet its true disruptive feature was not range or lethality. It was autonomy. It turned just enough. In the late 1950s, Soviet and Chinese air doctrine assumed missiles would either ride a radar beam or fly essentially straight, perhaps adjusting slightly but never behaving with apparent intent. Their early air-to-air systems required the launching aircraft to maintain control. Guidance was external, centralized, predictable. The idea of a compact weapon carrying its own seeker, correcting its own course, and pursuing a maneuvering target independently was understood conceptually but not expected operationally in frontline encounters. When the first MiG-17 pilot over the Taiwan Strait reported that a missile had followed his brake turn, ground control initially rejected the claim. Missiles did not chase. They traveled. They obeyed geometry. What he described violated the technological expectations embedded in Soviet tactical manuals. His name may have been Lee. Translation and archival ambiguity make certainty impossible. But what matters is not the name. What matters is the decision. He ejected. Others followed. In intelligence summaries from 1959, analysts used the term samo-navodenia, self-guidance, when describing American capabilities. It is a technical phrase, neutral, almost sterile. But in pilot debriefings, another expression appears repeatedly. Samostoyatelnoe presledovanie. Independent pursuit. That is not laboratory language. That is the vocabulary of being hunted. The distinction reveals the widening gap between engineers and aviators. On paper, the Sidewinder was a heat-seeking device with limited maneuver authority. In the cockpit, it was something that changed direction because you changed direction. Training documents advised aggressive evasive maneuvers, high G turns, attempts to force overshoot. Nowhere did they recommend abandoning a serviceable aircraft upon launch detection. Yet that behavior emerged organically. In June 1959, 2 MiG-19 pilots, engaging Taiwanese F-86s, encountered Sidewinders in precisely this context. One pilot observed the missile detach and curve subtly into his turn. He transmitted his intent to eject before separation. Roughly 4 seconds later, he was descending under canopy, while the missile struck the aircraft he had just vacated. His wingman witnessed the entire sequence and relayed it to ground control. The debrief of that wingman, released decades later from Russian archives, repeats the phrase independent pursuit 3 times in 2 pages. He describes the missile's path as continuous correction, not a straight trajectory with minor deviation. He estimated the tracking arc at 40 degrees. Technically, that was almost certainly an exaggeration. The AIM-9B lacked the authority for such dramatic deflection. Here is where language becomes as important as machinery. The word that keeps surfacing in pilot debriefs is presledovanie. It stems from presledovat, to pursue, but the verb carries weight beyond neutral movement. In Russian, you can sledovat, simply follow. You can etiza, go after. Those are procedural, unemotional. Presledovat is different. It is the word used for hunting prey through forest shadows, for persecuting an enemy without relief, for relentless chase that implies intent. When pilots chose presledovanie to describe what the missile was doing, they were not describing geometry. They were describing being hunted. American intelligence analysts, who obtained fragments of these reports through Taiwanese channels, translated samostoyatelnoe presledovanie into phrases like autonomous tracking or self-guided pursuit, technically precise, emotionally flattened. The translation captured the mechanics, but not the psychology. By 1961, NATO analysts had recognized a repeatable behavioral pattern and assigned it their own sterile label, preemptive separation. The phrase sounds clinical, almost bureaucratic. It means ejecting before impact based on visual assessment that interception is inevitable. 7 confirmed cases that year across different squadrons and aircraft types. The pattern was consistent. Missile launch observed, corrective turn initiated, missile continues to adjust. Pilot calculates survival odds, canopy separates. One story sits at the edge of documentation, sourced to a 1973 RAND study citing unnamed defector testimony. A MiG-19 pilot reportedly ejected early, only to watch the Sidewinder miss and his aircraft continue flying briefly before crashing elsewhere. He then faced the burden of explaining why he had abandoned a jet that had not yet been destroyed. I have searched for corroboration in Soviet archives and found none. It may be true. It may be apocryphal. It may have circulated as gallows humor among pilots, a cautionary tale about misjudging inevitability. Yet its persistence matters. Stories, whether factual or embellished, shape behavior as effectively as official doctrine. The technical reality complicates the myth. The AIM-9B could generate roughly 12 Gs at peak performance. On paper, a MiG-17 structural limit hovered near 8 Gs, though human tolerance without modern anti-G suits rarely exceeded 7 in sustained turns. The MiG-19 offered marginal improvement. In pure aerodynamic terms, escape was not impossible. But doctrine had conditioned pilots to believe that guided weapons of the era flew straight or rode beams. The shock was not that the missile could outturn them at extreme angles. The shock was that it turned at all, independently, without visible external guidance. Soviet engineers understood proportional navigation in theory. They had studied the mathematics of continuous course correction to maintain collision geometry with a moving target. Prototypes existed. What they lacked in frontline service by the late 1950s was a compact, reliable infrared seeker capable of autonomous operation without radar support from the launching aircraft. At China Lake, American engineers achieved functionality not through complexity but restraint. The AIM-9B seeker was essentially a lead sulfide detector, cooled by compressed gas, tuned to sense infrared radiation from something hot, like a jet exhaust. The detector generated an electrical signal proportional to heat intensity. That signal fed into control surfaces. The missile adjusted toward the source. No onboard computer in the modern sense. No elaborate processing. Elegant simplicity. It did not need to be brilliant. It needed to be consistent. Soviet intelligence was aware that the United States was experimenting with heat-seeking missiles. What they underestimated was the timeline to operational maturity and the practical reliability once deployed. The gap between knowing a technology exists and encountering it in combat is vast. In that gap, assumptions harden. A declassified GRU technical estimate from 1957 assessed American infrared guidance research as promising but immature, and projected operational readiness no earlier than 1962. That miscalculation, 4 years on paper, translated into seconds in the cockpit. Because in October 1958, over contested airspace far from Moscow's analytic tables, a MiG-17 pilot, identified only by aircraft number, described something that should not yet have existed. In his translated debrief, he wrote that the missile corrected along multiple axes simultaneously. He had initiated a climbing left turn at launch detection. According to his account, the missile followed the climb and the turn. He separated from the aircraft at roughly 8,000 feet. 3 seconds later, the Sidewinder detonated against the fuselage he had just abandoned. What lingers is not the ejection, but the language. Pilots describe maneuvers in direction and altitude: left, right, climb, dive. Axes belong to engineers and mathematicians. When a combat aviator reaches for geometric terminology, it suggests that ordinary vocabulary failed him. He was trying to describe behavior that did not fit within his learned framework. That single phrase appears once in the archive and vanishes. The file that contains it focuses primarily on radar analysis. The pilot's fate is unrecorded. Did he fly again? Did he trust the sky afterward? The documents are silent. Physically, nothing supernatural occurred. The AIM-9B was operating exactly as designed, following an infrared source within its performance envelope. Yet perception in combat is shaped by expectation, and expectation in 1958 Soviet doctrine was rigid. Missiles flew ballistic paths or rode beams. They did not independently curve through space in response to your movement. When context is absent, physics feels like betrayal. Early Soviet ejections were not failures of bravery. They were failures of framework. Once updated intelligence assessments filtered into training syllabi and instructors began explaining proportional navigation and infrared homing in practical terms, premature separations decreased. The missile did not become less lethal. The pilots became less surprised. Soviet manuals from 1956 taught that hard turns and rapid altitude changes would force a missile outside its engagement geometry. That guidance worked against beam riding systems and unguided rockets. It was logical, rooted in experience. Against the Sidewinder, however, the premise fractured. A MiG-17 or MiG-19, flown skillfully, could outturn an AIM-9B in absolute terms. But the missile did not need to win a turning contest. It needed only to adjust enough to remain on an intercept path. Compounding the shock was launch geometry. The AIM-9B could acquire roughly 30 degrees off bore sight. In practical terms, an American fighter offset from the classic 6 o'clock position, 30 degrees displaced, was no longer harmless. Soviet defensive doctrine dictated increasing displacement to degrade a gun solution or break radar lock. Against a heat seeker, that maneuver simply lengthened the missile's arc. It continued to track. By 1960, revised Soviet training materials acknowledged autonomous infrared weapons explicitly. The countermeasures proposed were rational within known physics: break visual contact, dive toward terrain to complicate the seeker's heat discrimination, reduce throttle to lower exhaust signature, force the missile into ground clutter. Each tactic contained merit. Each demanded time, altitude, and composure. And time, in the first seconds after launch, was precisely what the early encounters had stripped away. The evolution of understanding did not erase fear, but it replaced the sense of impossibility with parameters. Once pilots grasped that the missile's multiple axis correction was bounded by limits, G-ceilings, acquisition cones, thermal sensitivity, the enemy transformed from an unknowable hunter into a system with weaknesses. On paper, countermeasures looked clean and rational. In reality, you had 2 or 3 seconds between seeing smoke and becoming wreckage. No manual ever addressed the moment when doctrine collapses in front of your eyes, when you have just watched 3 men execute the prescribed break turn perfectly and still vanish in fire. Training says evade. Experience says die. In that gap, survival becomes brutally simple. You pull the handle. North Vietnamese Air Force archives from 1965 show the pattern intensifying as American F-4 Phantoms and F-8 Crusaders entered sustained combat carrying improved AIM-9 variants. MiG-17ES and MiG-21s were meeting heat seekers not as rumors but as routine threats. The reports note increasing instances of early separation, pilots ejecting seconds after launch detection, aircraft destroyed without anyone inside. On April 9, 1965, 4 MiG-17s rose to intercept a strike group. 2 pressed the attack. When Sidewinders left Navy F-8 rails, both MiG pilots ejected almost immediately. Their aircraft were hit moments later. The remaining 2 MiGs disengaged without firing and returned to base. The American after-action summary suggested possible mechanical malfunction in multiple enemy aircraft. Years later, a captured North Vietnamese report framed the same event differently. Pilots evaluated weapon capability, judged survival probability unacceptable, executed emergency separation, a tactical withdrawal described as equipment preservation. The language is cold, calculated. The reality was not. Fear had become structured, procedural, almost bureaucratic. The pattern resurfaced elsewhere. In 1967, over the Taiwan Strait, PLAAF MiG-19S fighters engaged Republic of China, Air Force F-104, starfighters armed with AIM-9 Sidewinders, incrementally improved but conceptually unchanged. Across 2 days, 3 engagements occurred. 2 Chinese pilots ejected early. 1 remained in his aircraft. The missile malfunctioned and failed to detonate. He landed and reported that American missiles were unreliable and could be defeated with aggressive maneuvering. The 2 who had separated were grounded temporarily and reassigned to training duties. Staying with the jet and surviving by chance was praised as resolve. Correctly assessing lethal probability and living was treated as hesitation. Institutional psychology can be harsher than combat physics. American aviators had their own mythology. They called successful Sidewinder hits golden BB shots, rare alignments of geometry, range, heat signature, and missile performance. The phrase diminished the shooter's agency and elevated luck. Statistically, most Sidewinders missed. The few that struck felt improbable even to the men who fired them. But to North Vietnamese pilots, these were not golden accidents. They were weapons behaving consistently from launch angles their doctrine labeled low threat. The discrepancy in perception widened the psychological divide. By May 1967, during the intense Package 6 strike missions over Hanoi, Navy F-4 Phantoms carried AIM-9D models with improved seekers and better tracking stability. The core principle, however, remained unchanged: autonomous infrared pursuit. 5 recorded engagements that day involved MiG-17 scrambling into layered American formations. What followed was no longer shock at the existence of turning missiles. It was calculation under pressure, pilots weighing updated training against immediate visual evidence. Some attempted low-altitude dives to blend exhaust with ground clutter. Some chopped throttle to cool signatures. Some pressed attacks despite launch warnings. And some, still, chose separation the instant they saw a missile adjust in response to their maneuver. The revolution was no longer technological. It was psychological attrition measured in seconds. The Sidewinder had forced a new equation into air combat. Not can I outturn the missile, but do I trust the limits I've been taught? By mid-1967, the pattern was no longer anecdotal. 3 MiG pilots ejecting before impact in a single cluster of engagements was not coincidence. It was repetition. All 3 aircraft were destroyed moments later. Empty shells absorbing explosions meant for men who had already made their choice. American intelligence began categorizing these incidents separately from conventional shoot-downs. A July 1967 briefing lists pilot separation prior to weapon impact as its own analytical column, 12 confirmed cases in 1 month. The document speculates about faulty ejection seats. It is the wrong conclusion drawn from the correct data. The gun camera frame sequences tell a different story. In one declassified mission report, a MiG-17 is frozen in a hard left brake. Next frame, canopy departing. Next, seat firing, then a parachute opening against the sky. 3 frames later, the Sidewinder strikes the empty fuselage. From canopy separation to detonation, roughly 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not hysteria. 4 seconds is a decision made under compression. By late 1967, Soviet advisors embedded with the North Vietnamese began adjusting tactics. Formations tightened to complicate target isolation. Coordinated defensive breaks attempted to overload American firing geometry. Head-on passes were encouraged to deny exhaust aspect and reduce infrared exposure. These refinements helped at the margins, but they could not erase the central fact. The missile worked, and the pilots knew it worked. A 1968 Naval Intelligence debrief of a MiG-21 pilot, who defected to Thailand, offers a rare internal glimpse. He described squadron briefings where commanders acknowledged the Sidewinder's capability, yet emphasized preservation of aircraft as a strategic priority. In his interpretation, the calculus implied that pilots were replaceable. Airframes were not. He considered the logic inverted. Quietly, many others did as well. Officially, early ejections were never labeled cowardice. Unofficially, reputations were shaped in corridors and evaluation notes. Pilots who stayed with doomed aircraft were honored. Pilots who survived by judging the odds accurately were sometimes sidelined. Heroism was visible. Calculation was ambiguous. When asked how frequently early separation occurred, the defector estimated nearly 30% of the engagements he personally witnessed involving Sidewinders ended with pre-impact ejection. The number seems inflated against American archival confirmation, but perception inside a squadron is not bound by external statistics. Not every engagement was filmed. Not every ejection was observable from the opposing side. Memory aggregates the dramatic. By 1968, cumulative attrition reduced interceptor sortie rates noticeably. Some American strike packages encountered minimal resistance. Others faced only the most experienced survivors. The pilots who had either mastered the new geometry or endured it long enough to internalize its limits. Many who had ejected early were reassigned to instruction or ground roles. Intelligent survival often meant the end of frontline flying. The war continued regardless. That institutional tension forced doctrinal evolution. Soviet training materials revised in 1968 addressed heat-seeking missiles directly with practical countermeasures. Coordinated bracket maneuvers to force seeker confusion, aggressive closure to exploit minimum engagement ranges, synchronized brake turns designed to cross flight paths and complicate infrared tracking. The language became technical rather than speculative. The psychological fog began to lift as understanding replaced myth. The missile had not changed in essence, comprehension had. And that transition, from fear of the unknown to adaptation against a defined system, marks the closing arc of this phase of the story. Because once a weapon is understood, it ceases to be supernatural. It becomes another variable in a lethal equation. By the end of the 1960s, ignorance was no longer the problem. Pilots understood what was coming at them. They had diagrams now, clean, technical sketches in 1969 training manuals mapping Sidewinder launch envelopes, shaded cones of acquisition, recommended brake vectors plotted like mathematical solutions. The advice was correct. Recognition of launch, immediate high G maneuver, performance margin over the missile's tracking capability. 3 requirements. In combat, most pilots had 2. Survival demanded all 3 at once, under stress, at low altitude, with seconds to decide. By 1970, magnesium flares began appearing under MiG fuselages, bright decoys designed to burn hotter than turbine exhaust and seduce infrared seekers away from metal and flesh. Early systems were crude and manually triggered. You had to know you were being hunted before you could deploy them. And knowing often meant you were already inside the missile's lethal window. Some pilots developed instinctive timing. Many never had enough repetitions to refine it. Attrition is a poor training method. Through the early 1970s, the numbers shifted only incrementally. American Sidewinder variants improved seeker stability and tracking fidelity. Soviet and Chinese countermeasures improved deployment techniques and tactical coordination. The exchange stabilized into a grim equilibrium. The missile did not become mythical again, but it never became irrelevant. In the Taiwan Strait, engagements grew rarer after 1967, yet the dynamic persisted whenever jets met. ROCAF fighters, F-100s, F-104s, later F-5s, carried heat seekers on their rails. PLAF MiG-9s and early MiG-20s climbed to intercept. Sometimes pilots held their nerve and beat the envelope. Sometimes they died trying. Sometimes they separated early and lived with the aftermath. 1 August 1971. PLAAF report describes a MiG-19 pilot who survived a Sidewinder shot through disciplined maneuvering and returned to base to commendation for composure and technical precision. 3 weeks later, he faced another launch. This time, he ejected before impact. The aircraft was destroyed. The second report does not reference the first. No psychological commentary, no explanation for altered behavior. Both outcomes left him alive. Only one was praised. Archival traces from this period are thin. Fragmented Taiwanese summaries, sparse mainland documentation, intelligence digests that sometimes duplicate events under different headings. I found references suggesting 4 early separations between 1969 and 1974, though cross-verification remains uncertain. The phenomenon diminished, but never vanished. Heat-seeking missiles remained part of the air combat environment, and human beings continued making compressed decisions inside shrinking time frames. The final documented case I located appears in 1979, over Afghanistan. A Soviet pilot reported a heat-seeking launch from insurgent forces, likely an early Stinger or a captured Western system. He ejected. The missile missed. His aircraft crashed unrecovered in mountainous terrain. The debrief labeled his action prudent, given uncertain weapon parameters. No reprimand. No medal. Just professional acknowledgement. 21 years after the first startled ejections over contested straits, institutional attitude had shifted. Early separation was no longer automatically suspect. It was situational judgment. The People's Liberation Army Air Force in 1967 had used the phrase Daodan yichang, missile anomaly, in several reports. Yichang does not mean broken. It means behavior outside expected bounds, irregular relative to doctrine. A July 1967 report describes a MiG-19 pilot observing an American air-to-air weapon displaying abnormal flight characteristics inconsistent with known guidance systems. He maneuvered. The weapon continued to track. He separated at approximately 6,000 meters. 5 seconds later, the aircraft was gone. The document avoids naming the missile, avoids specifying infrared guidance. It records only anomaly.